Imagine taking a map of an entire continent, a place with thousands of different cultures and kingdoms, and just completely redrawing it in only a few decades. Well, that's exactly what happened in the late 1800s when European powers got into a frantic race to claim as much of Africa as they could. We call this the Scramble for Africa. And believe me, it changed the world forever. So that brings up a huge question, right? How on earth could a whole continent full of its own diverse people and powerful histories get carved up by outsiders from thousands of miles away? Let's dig in and see how this scramble for Africa really went down.
Here's our game plan. We're going to look at the scramble itself, then figure out the motives behind it. Think profit, power, and pride. After that, we'll see the rules they made up in Berlin, how they actually drew these new lines on the map, and finally, we'll talk about the legacy all of this left behind.
Okay, so let's set the scene. For hundreds of years, Europeans mostly just stuck to the coast of Africa for trading. The massive interior of the continent, it was basically a huge mystery to them. On their maps, they even called it the Dark Continent, not because of the people, but because it was just a big unknown blank space to them. But then, around the 1880s, everything changed. The spark that lit the whole powder keg was actually one guy, King Leopold II of Belgium. He personally hired explorers to claim a gigantic piece of land in the Congo River Basin just for himself, not even for his country, for him. This move made the other European nations totally panic. They basically thought, whoa, if we don't grab a piece now, we're going to get left out. And just like that, the race was on. So what was behind this sudden, frantic rush for land? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was this really powerful mix of three main motives: profit, power, and pride. Let's break down how each of these fueled the fire. First up, and this is a big one, profit. At its heart, a lot of the scramble was about the chance to make an incredible amount of money. European countries looked at Africa and just saw dollar signs. See, Europe was right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and its factories were absolutely starving for raw materials. They needed rubber for things like tires and hoses, copper for electrical wiring, and Africa had tons of it. Plus, there was gold, there were diamonds, you get the picture. It was also seen as a brand new market, a whole continent of people to sell their manufactured goods to. Owning a colony looked like a guaranteed way to make your nation rich. The second driver was power. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was pure politics. You can think of it like a giant, high-stakes game of chess, and Africa suddenly became the new chessboard. Back in the 19th century, having a big empire was the ultimate status symbol. It showed you were a major world power. Nations like Great Britain and France were already huge rivals, and pretty soon Germany, Portugal, and others wanted in on the action. There was this constant fear that if your enemy claimed a new territory, they'd get stronger and you'd get weaker. It was a mad dash to plant your flag before someone else could. And the final piece of this puzzle was pride. This wasn't just about what governments wanted. It was about national pride and getting the public back home excited about the whole idea of empire. I mean, having a massive empire made people feel super patriotic. Leaders would use these exciting stories of exploration and conquest in Africa to get popular support. Imagine being a kid in school and seeing a world map where a huge chunk of it was painted your country's color. It was a really powerful way to unite everyone behind the government's ambitions.
So, with this crazy race for land heating up, there was a very real danger that these European countries would actually start a war with each other over Africa. To stop that from happening, the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, called a big meeting in 1884. It was called the Berlin Conference.
Now, here's the most mind-blowing fact about this whole conference. You had 14 European nations plus the United States all sitting down to decide the future of Africa. And the number of African leaders who were actually invited to have a say in this? 0. Not a single one. The fate of an entire continent was being decided by people who, in many cases, had never even been there. The main rule they all agreed on was something called effective occupation. Basically, it meant you couldn't just sail up to a coast, stick a flag in the ground and say, "This is mine now." Nope, you had to prove you were actually in control of the area by setting up a government, having a police force, something to show you were running the place. The crazy irony here is that this rule, which was designed to make the process orderly, actually made the scramble happen faster. It forced nations to rush soldiers and officials deep into the continent to lock down their claims.
So, with the rules of the game set, the carving up of Africa really kicked into high gear, and the way they did it would create problems that are still around today.
Before all this, the boundaries inside Africa were, organic. They were based on culture, language, and where different kingdoms had historically been. They made sense to the people who lived there. The new borders, they were drawn in meeting rooms in Europe with a pen and a ruler. These diplomats were looking at maps and worrying about who got access to a river or who controlled a mountain range. They paid zero attention to the actual people on the ground. This meant that suddenly one ethnic group could be split in half by a new border, while two rival groups who had been enemies for centuries were now stuck together in the same colony.
The change was just total. All across the continent, local kings and chiefs were replaced by European governors. Complex trading systems that had existed for centuries were completely rewired to just ship raw materials back to Europe. And those natural cultural borders were just erased and replaced with these rigid, straight lines that would eventually become the borders of modern African countries.
Now, it is so important to understand that African people did not just sit back and watch this happen. Absolutely not. There was resistance everywhere, from leaders sending diplomatic protests to people taking up arms and fighting. But the European armies had a massive technological edge. The most famous example is the Maxim gun. It was the world's first fully automatic machine gun, and it meant that a small European force could often defeat a much, much larger African army. The scramble itself eventually ended, but its impact? Well, that's a whole other story. Let's talk about the legacy of these decisions, because it's something that continues to shape the continent today.
You can literally trace a direct line from those conference rooms in Berlin to some of the challenges in Africa today. Those artificial borders that forced rival groups together, they laid the groundwork for future conflicts. The economies that were designed only to export resources, they made it really hard for newly independent nations to build their own strong economies. So even when African countries finally won their independence in the 20th century, they were often stuck with these colonial-era borders and systems that were incredibly difficult to overcome.
One of the clearest legacies you can see today is language. In so many African nations, the official language, the one used in government and in schools, isn't a local one. It's English or French or Portuguese. And that's a direct echo of which European country colonized that particular piece of land. And really, that's the main takeaway here. The scramble for Africa wasn't just some event in a history book. It was a process that completely rewired a continent. It's a powerful reminder of how lines drawn on a map with a ruler, more than 100 years ago, can cast an incredibly long shadow, shaping the lives, politics, and futures of millions of people, even today.